Welcome back to From Washington al Mundo. I'm your host, Mauricio Claver Carone, and I have my dear friend with me, Shahriar Etminani, director of the Iran Democratic Union, and talking about some of the current events surrounding Iran, which are obviously so important to all of our security, and more importantly, frankly, because at the end of the day, it would end the security issues for human freedom. If the Iranian people were free, we wouldn't be dealing with a lot of these security issues. So here's the $1 million question that I mentioned before the break that I want to ask you. Here's what I cannot reconcile. There seems to be more international consensus as regards sanctioning and pressuring Iran than there is even towards Syria, which is on the top of the news. I mean, we just saw in the UN how Russia and China keeps blocking. Not that they're real gung-ho in regards to Iran, but less so, frankly. Now, we know that it's because of the nuclear issue, and the nuclear issue is a game changer, but it's still in development stages. So why isn't there but yet there seems to be more support from the United States and the West for regime change in Syria than there is in Iran. Yet Iran is almost a greater threat than Syria. Is a greater threat, frankly, than Syria.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Why?
So why does the United States support regime change in Syria and not regime change in Iran?
Yeah.
Funny you say that. Some of my colleagues and friends were invited to the White House along with some regime apologists and supporters a couple of weeks ago, and my friends raised this issue of regime change in Iran. And I don't know who it was, but either someone at NSC or State Department or White House said, our policy in Iran is not regime change. Our policy in Syria is regime change, but not Iran. So my question...
So they recognized that they have a policy of regime... I mean, the president has said it. But they recognize that they have a policy of regime change in Syria, but not in Iran.
Yeah, absolutely. They're adamant about that. So if I was there, which I wasn't, my question to them would be, imagine if 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, before the uprising in Syria, you did actually have a policy of regime change in Syria, as opposed to the fallacy and this false hope of reform. And imagine if you had basically supported the liberal Democrats, where they would have good leadership, they have good funding, good organization, good coordination. If that had happened 2, 3, 4 years ago in Syria, Assad would have been over a long time ago, and we wouldn't have had all these deaths in Syria. So now that we're in the middle of a civil war, and we are in the middle of a civil war in Syria, finally they wake up and they want regime change in Syria, where who knows who's who, what's what, and no one really knows what will happen if Syria falls. So my argument is that if they woke up today and they got rid of this, again, another false, ridiculous concept of reform in Iran and negotiating with the regime about the nuclear issue and other issues, where they actually went and supported liberal Democrats, freedom-loving Iranians, and with funding and with coordination and help, that when Iranians do rise up, then the opposition will be much, much stronger and will be able to achieve the goal of getting rid of this regime with much less bloodshed than is happening in Syria. So as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to Iran, the only policy should be, how do we help the people get rid of this regime with minimal bloodshed? Everything else is noise. The nuclear issue is noise. The issue with GCC is noise. Reform is noise. Everything else is noise. Because as long as this regime is in power, the likelihood of war is too high. And the policy today, the way the United States has set up this policy, is negotiate. And on the other side is, we won't let Iranians get nuclear weapons. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that if negotiations fail, the only solution left is war. And I personally think that the likelihood of negotiations succeeding is very, very low, if not zero. But let's assume it's 50-50. There's a 50% likelihood that negotiations will fail, which means, based on today's policy, there's a 50% likelihood that we're going to war, which is ridiculous. And the sad part is all the anti-war knee-jerk, propagandists are supporting this policy. Where, I mean, you can see it. I mean, it's a Chinese water torture. You can just see it taking us towards war. And there's absolutely no other policy out there that could divert us away from this catastrophe.
And you would think, policymakers would have learned their lesson. We've seen, I mean, this is not a theory. I'm not theorizing on what lobbying strategies by these regimes were. It's on pen and paper. We saw when Gaddafi fell, the lobbying contracts and papers and strategy emails with them and their lobbyists and PR firms in Boston, etc. They outlined, sell the regime as a reformist regime so that we can stay in power, keep doing what we're doing, etc. Now, in Syria, in London, same thing. Their PR firms sell the regime as a reformist regime, put Assad's wife on Vogue. Put her with the kids, have all this thing. It's the same thing that's happening in Cuba. It's the same thing that's happening in Iran. And it's the same. Yeah. It's the same game book, but yet it's almost like our policymakers just don't.
And with Iran, it's been happening, much longer, much more sophisticated, because the consequences are much greater than in Libya and Syria. No offense to Libyans and Syrians. Sure. Basically, the two lobbies out there fighting right now. One is, let's go to war. The other one is let's cut a deal with them and basically, learn to live with them. And it's a schizophrenic concept, and there's no middle ground. There's no no one. I mean, if you speak to a serious policymaker, it's funny. A friend of mine met with a senator. Very liberal senator, and she explained the whole regime change concept, and let's make sure people understand. By regime change, we're not talking war.
Sure.
I mean, Iraq is not necessarily the only form of regime change. Mm-hmm. By regime change, I mean helping the people through tangible and intangible means to basically help them get rid of this regime themselves. So that's what I personally mean by regime change. Agreed. So she, went through this whole regime concept. And you know what the liberal Democrat senator's response was? You know what? That sounds all perfect. So why do we not have that policy? Could it be that because that was Bush's policy? And he admitted it. not in public. He wasn't in public. But in private, he admitted it. That basically is this knee-jerk reaction to, okay, well, Bush said X, so therefore X must be wrong. We must go Y. Meanwhile, 70 million people are suffering under sanctions, or suffering under this regime, or suffering, brutal economic conditions, and are at the edge of going to war. To go back to your lobbyist, there's absolutely no doubt there are, certain groups that are getting directions directly from Tehran, and then under them, you have the useful idiots who run around, just have this knee-jerk reaction, like this academic last week who just got promoted to dean of a foreign policy school. Again, last week he wrote, the only way to help Syria is to cut a deal with the regime in Tehran. Every other week he comes up with some excuse to cut a deal with the regime in Iran.
Is that the new dean at SAIS?
I don't want to name names.
I'll name names. Yeah. The new dean at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University.
It is unbelievable. he can't find anything wrong in this world that cannot be solved with cutting a deal with the regime in Tehran, and by that means selling the people down the river, because cutting a deal with the regime in Iran means that we the world will let you live, the mullahs of Iran, as you wish within Iran, and you can do whatever you want to the people.
By the way, and a lot of these things translate. The reason that same individual that you're talking about, the dean at the School of Advanced International Studies in Johns Hopkins, who's writing this mentality, was a senior advisor for the Obama administration.
State Department, absolutely.
Exactly. So, absolutely. At the end of the day, it's that's the mentality that has been there. Yeah. And that's the policy they pursue.
And whether he has a direct link to Tehran or he's just an absolute useful idiot, I don't know. but it can't be anything else but one of those two. So
let me ask you, because a lot of this, obviously, all the talk of the nuclear issue crowds the news. Tell us a little bit about the pro-democracy movement in Iran. My fear is that the one thing that the regime loves is the fact to keep talking about this nuclear issue, because that way people aren't paying attention to what's happening, to the repression that's taking place in Iran, to what's taking place on a daily basis, to what the pro-democracy movement is doing, and to the political struggles that are taking place within. Tell us a little bit about what's currently going on.
I think the reform movement has kind of been shown that is no longer a viable option. So the only viable option is basically getting rid of this regime from the roots. And there are multiple different groups with different agendas. So you have ethnic minorities, religious minorities, you have royalists, you have Republicans, you have all kinds of groups out there that want an end to this regime. So the goal, is to build an umbrella that encompasses all these organizations with one thing in common, and that is to build a free, secular democracy. And if you're a Republican, with a small r, or if you're a monarchist, a constitutional monarchist, it doesn't matter. All that can be dealt with at the next stage. Right now, the goal is to get rid of this regime and to allow the people free elections to determine their own form of government, whether it's a secular republic or whether it's a constitutional monarchy. So that is happening. The monarchists and the Republicans are coming together. The ethnic minorities, the Kurds, the Baluchis, the Baha'is, they're coming under the umbrella, and the goal is a free secular democracy, an end to this regime, and all this needs obviously leadership. All this needs funding. All this needs coordination, and it's I think it's very difficult for us to put aside our differences. But we're getting to a point that our differences are minuscule compared to the problem that we have.
At the end of the day, what you need is unity of purpose. And unity of purpose and the idea of a free and democratic Iran. You want different ideas. You want different ideologies, because that's what a democracy is all about. Shahriar, thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you very much.
Please feel free to come back. This is your second home. And we will be extending an invitation to the show to Dean Vali Nasser of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, because I don't like to talk about anyone without inviting them to defend themselves. This is from Washington, Mundo. I'm your host, Mauricio Claver Carone. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.